Picture this, it's early 1898, and the United States is a country that most of the world doesn't take seriously on the global stage. Sure, America has wealth, industry, and a growing population, but when European powers gather to discuss world affairs, American diplomats are barely invited to the table. The United States controls no overseas territories beyond a few small Pacific islands. The country has no real military presence outside its own borders. The Navy, while growing, is nowhere near the size of Britain's massive fleet or even Spain's aging armada. And then, in just over 3 months, everything changes. By August of that same year, America has decisively defeated a European colonial power, acquired an empire stretching across 2 oceans, and announced itself as a force that could no longer be ignored. This is the story of how a brief war with Spain transformed the United States from a regional power into a global superpower, and how the decision to fight that war and take those territories would shape not just American history, but the entire course of the 20th century. To understand how dramatic this transformation was, you have to understand where America stood before the war began. In the 1890s, the United States was going through an identity crisis. The frontier, which had defined American expansion for over a century, was officially closed according to the Census Bureau in 1890. For generations, Americans had always had somewhere to go, some new territory to settle, some new land to claim. That safety valve was now gone. At the same time, the country was industrializing at a breakneck pace. Factories were churning out goods faster than ever before. Steel production was skyrocketing. Railroads connected every corner of the country, but this rapid growth came with serious problems. The economy lurched from boom to bust. The Panic of 1893 had thrown millions out of work. Labor strikes were turning violent. Farmers were going bankrupt. There was a sense that America had built this enormous productive capacity, but now what? Where would it sell all these goods? Where would its surplus population go? European powers had solved similar problems through imperialism, building vast colonial empires in Africa and Asia. They had captive markets for their goods, sources of raw materials, and places to send their excess population. Many Americans started to wonder if their country should do the same. This wasn't just an economic question. It was deeply tied to ideas about race, civilization, and America's role in the world that seem shocking today, but were widely accepted then. Many Americans, particularly white Americans in positions of power, believed in what they called Anglo-Saxon superiority. They looked at the British Empire and saw not exploitation and oppression, but the spread of civilization, democracy, and progress. Writers like Josiah Strong argued that Anglo-Saxons had a duty to spread their superior institutions around the world. Politicians like Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt believed that great nations proved themselves through military conquest and the acquisition of empire. They looked at the map of the world, saw it carved up into European colonial holdings, and worried that America was missing out. They used language about national greatness, about virility and strength, about not being left behind in the great competition between nations. Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1898, openly worried that America was becoming soft, that without the test of war, without the challenge of imperial competition, the nation would lose its vitality. But not everyone agreed. There was significant opposition to the idea of American imperialism. Many Americans believed that their country was supposed to be different, that the United States had been founded on principles of self-government and freedom that were fundamentally incompatible with colonialism. They remembered that America itself had been a colony once, that the country had been born in a rebellion against imperial control. They worried that if America started conquering other peoples and denying them self-government, it would betray everything the country stood for. William Jennings Bryan, Andrew Carnegie, Mark Twain, and many others would become vocal opponents of American imperialism. But in early 1898, this debate was still largely theoretical. America didn't have an empire yet, and it wasn't clear that it would get one. Then came Cuba. The island of Cuba sits just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, close enough that you could almost see it on a clear day. It had been a Spanish colony for nearly 400 years, one of the last remnants of Spain's once mighty American empire. By the 1890s, most of Spain's colonies had won their independence, but Spain clung to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines with a grip born of desperation. These colonies were the last visible proof that Spain was still a great power, still relevant on the world stage. But in Cuba, the people had other ideas. They had been fighting for independence on and off since 1868. The latest rebellion had broken out in 1895, and this time it was serious. Cuban revolutionaries, led by figures like José Martí and Máximo Gómez, were using guerrilla warfare to make the island ungovernable. They burned sugar plantations, disrupted commerce, and attacked Spanish forces wherever they could. Spain responded with brutal tactics. General Valeriano Weyler, whom the American press would dub Butcher Weyler, implemented a policy of reconcentration. He forced rural Cubans into concentration camps, reasoning that if the civilian population was locked up, they couldn't support the guerrillas. The camps were overcrowded, unsanitary, and deadly. Thousands of Cubans died from disease and starvation. Reports of these conditions made their way back to the United States, where they were amplified by newspapers engaged in fierce competition for readers. This was the era of yellow journalism, when papers like William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World printed sensational, often exaggerated stories to boost circulation. They ran lurid tales of Spanish atrocities, of innocent Cuban women and children suffering under Spanish tyranny. The stories stirred up public sentiment, creating a groundswell of sympathy for the Cuban cause. But sympathy wasn't the only thing driving American interest in Cuba. The United States had significant economic investments on the island. American companies owned sugar plantations, mines, and railroads. American banks had loaned money to Cuban businesses. The ongoing war was destroying this property and disrupting trade. American sugar importers, who bought vast quantities of Cuban sugar, were losing money. There were calls from business interests to intervene to protect American property and restore order. At the same time, there was growing concern about having an unstable, war-torn territory so close to American shores. What if Spain lost control entirely? What if another European power, Germany perhaps, stepped in to fill the vacuum? Naval strategists worried that Cuba in the wrong hands could threaten American security and commerce. President William McKinley, who took office in March 1897, was initially reluctant to go to war. He was a Civil War veteran who had seen combat firsthand and knew its costs. He was also a cautious politician who understood that war was unpredictable and could have unintended consequences. He tried diplomatic pressure instead, urging Spain to grant reforms in Cuba, to recall Weyler, to offer the Cubans some form of autonomy. Spain, desperate to avoid war but equally desperate to hold on to its colonies, made some concessions. Weyler was recalled. Spain offered Cuba a form of limited self-government, but it wasn't enough. The Cuban revolutionaries wanted full independence, not autonomy within the Spanish Empire, and in Spain itself, there was fierce resistance to any concessions. Spanish public opinion, manipulated by conservative politicians and the Catholic Church, saw any compromise as a betrayal of national honor. Then came two events that made war almost inevitable. In February 1898, the New York Journal published a private letter from the Spanish ambassador to the United States, Enrique Dupuy de Lôme. Someone in Cuba had stolen the letter and leaked it to the press. In it, de Lôme described President McKinley as weak and a bidder for the admiration of the crowd. It wasn't the most insulting thing ever written about a president, but it was a diplomatic embarrassment. De Lôme resigned immediately, and Spain apologized, but the damage was done. The letter seemed to confirm that Spain didn't respect the United States, that Spanish diplomats were saying one thing in public and another in private. But that was nothing compared to what happened next. On the evening of February 15, 1898, the USS Maine, an American battleship that had been sent to Havana Harbor to protect American citizens and property, suddenly exploded and sank. The ship went down in minutes, killing 266 American sailors. Nobody knew what caused the explosion. It could have been an accident, a problem with the ship's boilers or ammunition storage. Could have been a mine placed by Spanish forces, though this seemed unlikely since Spain had no reason to provoke the United States. It could even have been a mine placed by Cuban revolutionaries trying to draw America into the war. Years later, investigations would suggest it was probably an accident, a coal bunker fire that spread to the ammunition magazine. But in February 1898, none of that mattered. The American press, led by Hearst and Pulitzer, immediately blamed Spain. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain" became the rallying cry. The public, already sympathetic to Cuba and suspicious of Spain, was outraged. McKinley still hesitated. He appointed a naval board of inquiry to investigate the sinking, and he continued to push for a diplomatic solution. But the pressure on him was becoming unbearable. Newspapers were calling him weak and cowardly. Members of his own Republican Party were demanding action. Theodore Roosevelt, his Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was practically begging for war. The public was angry and wanted revenge. Business interests were split. Some wanted war to end the instability in Cuba. Others worried that war would disrupt trade and damage the economy. But gradually, the sentiment for war overwhelmed the arguments for peace. On April 11, 1898, McKinley asked Congress for authorization to use military force to end the war in Cuba. He cited humanitarian concerns, the need to protect American citizens and property, and the threat that the continuing conflict posed to American interests. Congress debated for a week, and then, on April 19, passed a joint resolution authorizing the president to use force to secure Cuban independence. Critically, the resolution included the Teller Amendment, which pledged that the United States had no intention of annexing Cuba. America was going to war, it claimed, to liberate Cuba, not to conquer it. This was important because it helped maintain the moral high ground, the idea that this was a war of liberation, not imperialism. Of course, as events would prove, things would be more complicated than that. Spain, backed into a corner, declared war on April 23. The United States responded with its own declaration on April 25. The war had begun, and almost nobody expected what would happen next. Most people thought it would be a long, difficult conflict. Spain, after all, was still considered a significant military power. It had a large army, a substantial navy, and centuries of military tradition. The Spanish Navy included some modern armored cruisers and a number of experienced officers. Spain's army, while poorly equipped by European standards, had extensive experience fighting colonial wars. The United States, by contrast, had a tiny army of just 28,000 men, most of them scattered in small posts across the West. The American Navy was larger and more modern, but it was still smaller than Spain's. On paper, this looked like it could be a real contest. But appearances were deceiving. The Spanish military, while large on paper, was in terrible shape. The army was poorly trained, badly equipped, and riddled with corruption. Officers purchased their commissions rather than earning them through merit. Supplies that were supposed to go to soldiers were often stolen and sold for private profit. The troops in Cuba were exhausted from years of fighting guerrillas and ravaged by tropical diseases. Morale was low. The Navy was in even worse shape. Spain's ships looked impressive, but many of them were old, poorly maintained, and slow. The Spanish Navy hadn't fought a major engagement in decades, and many of its officers were more concerned with political connections than tactical skill. Spain's economy was weak, and the government was nearly bankrupt. The country simply didn't have the resources to fight a war across the Atlantic Ocean. The United States, meanwhile, had been quietly preparing. Alfred Thayer Mahan, an American naval officer and historian, had published a hugely influential book in 1890 called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Mahan argued that great nations were built on strong navies, that control of the seas was the key to national power and prosperity. His ideas had a profound impact on American naval policy. Throughout the 1890s, Congress had been funding the construction of modern battleships and cruisers. By 1898, the U.S. Navy had a fleet of new steel warships with powerful guns and thick armor. These ships were faster, better armed, and more modern than most of Spain's fleet. The Navy had also been planning for a war with Spain, conducting exercises and war games, studying Spanish naval bases, and preparing strategies. The man McKinley put in charge of the Navy's Asiatic Squadron was Commodore George Dewey, a 60-year-old veteran officer with a reputation for aggressive tactics and cool judgment. Dewey's squadron was based in Hong Kong, thousands of miles from Cuba, but within striking distance of the Philippines, Spain's other major colony. The Philippines were a sprawling archipelago of over 7,000 islands in the Western Pacific, home to millions of people and a valuable source of trade and resources. Spain had controlled the islands for over 300 years, ruling through a combination of colonial administrators, Catholic friars, and military force. But just like in Cuba, there was a growing independence movement. Filipino revolutionaries, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had been fighting Spanish rule since 1896. Theodore Roosevelt, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had been preparing for war for months. The moment war was declared, he sent Dewey a cable with simple instructions: proceed to the Philippines and destroy the Spanish fleet. This was a bold, even reckless move. The Philippines were on the other side of the world. If Dewey's squadron was defeated or even just damaged, it would be thousands of miles from any friendly port, unable to get supplies or repairs. But Roosevelt and other naval planners understood something crucial. If the United States could destroy Spain's naval forces, it could isolate Spain's colonial armies, cutting them off from reinforcements and supplies. Without their navy, Spain would be helpless to defend its overseas territories. Dewey didn't hesitate. He took his squadron, 4 modern cruisers and 2 gunboats, and steamed for Manila. The ships arrived at the entrance to Manila Bay on the night of April 30, 1898, just 1 week after war was declared. Dewey knew that the Spanish had placed mines in the harbor entrance and that shore batteries protected the bay, but he also knew that the Spanish defenses were probably in poor condition. He ordered his ships to enter the bay under cover of darkness, running past the defenses before the Spanish could react effectively. It was a calculated risk that paid off. The Spanish mines, most of them, turned out to be duds. The shore batteries fired wildly but hit nothing. By dawn on May 1, Dewey's squadron was inside Manila Bay, steaming toward the Spanish fleet. The Spanish fleet in Manila was commanded by Admiral Patricio Montojo, and he knew he was doomed. His ships were old, slow, and outgunned. Some of them were wooden-hulled vessels that had been built decades earlier. He had anchored his fleet in shallow water near the naval base at Cavite, hoping that if his ships sank, at least his crews could wade to shore. As the sun rose on May 1, Montojo watched the American ships approach in a line, their guns ready. At 5:40 in the morning, when the range had closed to about 5,000 yards, Dewey turned to the captain of his flagship and said, "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." It was a calm, almost casual order that would become one of the most famous lines in American military history. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. The American ships steamed back and forth in front of the Spanish fleet, pouring fire into the Spanish vessels. American gunnery was accurate and devastating. Spanish return fire was wild and ineffective. The Spanish sailors fought bravely, but they had no chance. Their guns couldn't penetrate the armor of the American ships, and their vessels were being torn apart. One by one, the Spanish ships caught fire, exploded, or sank. After 2 hours of firing, Dewey broke off the attack because he had received a mistaken report that his ships were running low on ammunition. He withdrew to count his ammunition and casualties. The result was almost unbelievable. Every Spanish ship had been destroyed or disabled. At least 150 Spanish sailors were dead and many more wounded. On the American side, only 8 men had been slightly wounded. Not a single American ship had been seriously damaged. When the count showed that ammunition was still plentiful, Dewey returned and completed the destruction of the Spanish fleet. Battle of Manila Bay was a stunning, complete victory. In a single morning, the United States had destroyed an entire Spanish fleet and taken control of one of Asia's most important harbors. The news reached Washington by telegram a few days later and caused a sensation. Americans were ecstatic. George Dewey became an instant national hero. Congress promoted him to Rear Admiral and later to the special rank of Admiral of the Navy. Celebrations broke out in cities across the country. The speed and completeness of the victory shocked everyone, including the Americans themselves. It had been almost too easy, but while the naval victory was complete, Dewey faced a problem. He controlled Manila Bay, but he didn't have enough troops to capture Manila itself. The city was defended by thousands of Spanish soldiers, and Dewey's Marines and sailors were too few to take it. He would have to wait for the army to arrive. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the army was scrambling to mobilize. Unlike the Navy, the army was completely unprepared for war. The regular army numbered only 28,000 men, far too few to invade Cuba. Congress authorized the recruitment of 200,000 volunteers, and men rushed to enlist all across the country. But the army had no plans for how to train, equip, and transport this sudden flood of new soldiers. There weren't enough rifles, uniforms, tents, or supplies. Training camps were set up hastily and quickly became overcrowded, unsanitary disasters. Soldiers drilled with broomsticks because there weren't enough rifles. They wore heavy wool uniforms in the Florida heat because nobody had thought to provide tropical clothing. The food was terrible, often spoiled, and there was a scandal over tainted beef that would become a major issue later. Disease, especially typhoid fever, swept through the camps and killed more men than Spanish bullets would. But somehow, despite the chaos, the army began to come together. The plan was to invade Cuba, defeat the Spanish forces there, and capture Havana, the capital. The main Spanish army in Cuba, about 150,000 troops, was concentrated around Havana and other major cities. But there was a smaller Spanish garrison in eastern Cuba at the city of Santiago. American naval intelligence had reported that a Spanish fleet under Admiral Pascual Cervera had left Spain and was heading to Cuba. If that fleet could reach Havana and resupply, it could threaten the American coast and make an invasion of Cuba much more difficult. The American Navy set out to find Cervera's fleet. Cervera, like Montojo in Manila, knew he was on a suicide mission. His fleet consisted of 4 armored cruisers and 3 destroyers, modern ships, but not enough to face the full might of the U.S. Navy. He wanted to stay in Spain, but political pressure forced him to sail. He crossed the Atlantic, dodging American patrols, and slipped into the harbor at Santiago on the southern coast of Cuba. The Americans quickly located him there and set up a blockade. Cervera was trapped. His ships couldn't leave without facing an American fleet that outnumbered and outgunned him. The Americans couldn't go into the harbor after him because the harbor entrance was narrow, mined, and covered by shore batteries. It was a stalemate, but one that favored the Americans. As long as Cervera was bottled up in Santiago, he couldn't threaten the American coast or interfere with an invasion. The solution was to capture Santiago from the land side. If American troops could take the city, they could force Cervera to either surrender his fleet or try to break out and face the American Navy in open water. So instead of landing near Havana as originally planned, the American army would land near Santiago, march overland, and attack the city. This was actually a much better plan than the original one. Santiago was defended by far fewer Spanish troops than Havana, and the terrain, while difficult, was manageable. The invasion force was placed under the command of General William Shafter, a 63-year-old Civil War veteran who weighed over 300 pounds and suffered badly from the heat. Shafter was not an inspiring leader, but he was competent and experienced. The American force that landed in Cuba in June 1898 was a strange mix. There were regular army units, volunteer regiments from every state, and several unique formations. The most famous was the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, better known as the Rough Riders. This regiment had been organized by Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt, who had resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to go fight. Roosevelt served as second in command, though he would later claim much of the credit for the regiment's accomplishments. The Rough Riders were a colorful bunch, a mix of Western cowboys, Eastern college athletes, Native American scouts, and adventure seekers. They got enormous press coverage, partly because Roosevelt was skilled at self-promotion and partly because they made good copy, but they were just one small part of the invasion force. There were also several regiments of African American soldiers, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers, who would fight with great distinction but receive far less recognition because of the racism of the era. The landing itself was chaotic. The army had no specialized landing craft, so soldiers had to transfer from transport ships to small boats and then wade ashore through the surf. Equipment got wet, supplies were lost, and the whole process took days longer than it should have. But the Spanish didn't seriously contest the landing. They had decided to concentrate their forces for the defense of Santiago itself. By June 24, about 16,000 American troops were ashore and beginning the march towards Santiago. The terrain was brutal. The roads were barely more than muddy tracks. The jungle was thick and nearly impassable off the roads. The heat was intense, and tropical diseases, especially yellow fever and malaria, began to take their toll. Soldiers collapsed from heat exhaustion. Some units lost more men to disease than to combat. Spanish had established defensive positions on the heights overlooking Santiago. The two main positions were San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill, ridges that commanded the approaches to the city. On July 1, American forces launched a frontal assault on these positions. It was a costly, confusing battle. American artillery support was inadequate. Communications broke down. Units got lost or separated. But the American soldiers, despite the heat, the terrain, and the Spanish fire, pressed forward. The Rough Riders, fighting on foot because their horses had been left behind in Florida, charged up Kettle Hill alongside regular cavalry units, including African American troopers. Roosevelt, always at the front, would later claim this as his greatest moment. On San Juan Hill, infantry units including the 24th Infantry, an African American regiment, charged up the slope in the face of Spanish machine gun and rifle fire. The fighting was intense and deadly. Spanish soldiers, though outnumbered, fought stubbornly from their prepared positions, but American firepower, particularly from rapid-firing Gatling guns, was overwhelming. By the end of the day, American forces had taken both hills at a cost of over 1,000 casualties. The Spanish lost fewer men, but were forced to retreat into Santiago itself. The Americans now occupied the high ground overlooking the city. They could shell Santiago at will, and it was only a matter of time before the city fell. Spanish morale collapsed. Soldiers and civilians alike were running out of food and ammunition. Disease was rampant. The situation was hopeless. Admiral Cervera, still trapped in Santiago harbor, knew that he couldn't just sit there and let his fleet be captured when the city surrendered. On July 3, he received orders to try to break out of the harbor. It was a suicide mission, and Cervera knew it, but honor demanded that he try. Early on the morning of July 3, his ships raised steam and headed for the harbor entrance. American lookouts spotted them immediately, and alarm signals went up. The American fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral William Sampson and Commodore Winfield Scott Schley, had been waiting for this moment for weeks. The American ships sprang into action, racing to intercept the Spanish vessels as they emerged from the harbor. What followed was a running battle along the Cuban coast. The Spanish ships tried to escape by steaming west at full speed, but the American ships were faster. One by one, American battleships and cruisers closed in on the Spanish vessels and pounded them with heavy gunfire. The Spanish fought back bravely, but they were hopelessly outmatched. Within 4 hours, every Spanish ship had been destroyed. Some were blown up, others driven ashore and set on fire. About 350 Spanish sailors died, and another 150 were wounded. On the American side, only one man was killed and one wounded. It was another overwhelming, almost unbelievable victory. The Spanish Navy, already crippled by the loss at Manila Bay, now ceased to exist as a fighting force. With Cervera's fleet destroyed, Santiago was doomed. The Spanish commander in the city, General José Toral, opened negotiations for surrender. On July 17, after 2 weeks of talks, Spanish forces in Santiago formally surrendered. About 24,000 Spanish soldiers laid down their arms and were sent back to Spain. The Americans had won. The campaign had lasted less than 2 months, and while it had cost American lives, mostly to disease, it had been a decisive victory. Cuba was effectively liberated from Spanish rule, though what would happen next was still unclear. Back in the Philippines, events had moved forward as well. After Dewey's victory at Manila Bay, the U.S. Army had sent an expeditionary force to capture Manila and secure the islands. Dewey had also been cooperating, somewhat cautiously, with Filipino independence fighters led by Emilio Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo and his forces had been fighting the Spanish for years, and they controlled much of the countryside around Manila. Aguinaldo believed that the Americans had come to help the Philippines gain independence, just as they were supposedly doing in Cuba. American officials encouraged this belief, though they carefully avoided making any firm promises. When American troops arrived in late July, they found that Aguinaldo's forces had already surrounded Manila and were ready to attack. On August 13, American and Filipino forces launched a coordinated assault on Manila. The Spanish defenders, knowing that the war was already lost, put up only token resistance. They had been in secret negotiations with the Americans, trying to arrange a surrender that would allow Spanish forces to surrender to the Americans rather than to the Filipinos. The Spanish were terrified of what might happen if they surrendered to the Filipinos, given the brutality with which Spain had ruled the islands. The Americans agreed to this face-saving arrangement. After a brief exchange of fire, the Spanish forces in Manila surrendered. Critically, the Americans then refused to allow Filipino forces to enter the city. Aguinaldo and his fighters, who had been fighting Spain for years and who had done much of the work surrounding Manila, were shut out of the city they had helped capture. This betrayal would have serious consequences. On August 12, 1898, Spain and the United States signed a preliminary peace protocol suspending hostilities. The actual fighting had lasted only about 3.5 months, from late April to mid-August. Spain had been thoroughly defeated on land and sea, in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. Spanish forces in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines had all surrendered or been isolated. Spain's navy had been utterly destroyed. The Spanish government, facing possible revolution at home if the war continued, was desperate for peace. The United States, victorious beyond anyone's expectations, was now in a position to dictate terms. But what should those terms be? This question sparked an intense debate in the United States. The Teller Amendment had promised that America wouldn't annex Cuba, so that was settled. Cuba would become independent, or at least nominally so. But what about Puerto Rico, which American forces had also occupied? And most controversially, what about the Philippines? Here was an archipelago of islands on the other side of the world, home to millions of people, rich in resources, and strategically located. Some Americans argued that the United States should take the Philippines, that it was the spoils of war, that it would give America a foothold in Asia, that it would provide markets and resources, that it was America's duty to civilize and Christianize the Filipino people. Never mind that most Filipinos had been Catholics for centuries. Others argued just as passionately that taking the Philippines would betray American principles, that it would turn the United States into a colonial power, just like the European nations America had always criticized, that Filipinos deserved their independence just as much as Cubans did. President McKinley agonized over the decision. He later claimed that he prayed for guidance and that God told him to take the Philippines to educate and uplift and civilize and Christianize the Filipinos. This story is almost certainly apocryphal, but it captures the paternalistic, racist thinking that underlay much of the pro-imperialism argument. Many Americans genuinely believed that Filipinos were incapable of self-government, that they needed American guidance and control, that leaving them independent would result in chaos or conquest by some other power. Others were more cynically motivated by economic and strategic concerns. Business interests saw opportunities for trade and investment. Naval planners saw Manila Bay as a perfect base for projecting American power in Asia. Politicians saw an empire as proof of American greatness. In October, McKinley appointed commissioners to negotiate the final peace treaty with Spain. He instructed them to demand Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Spain, defeated and desperate, had no choice but to agree, though Spanish negotiators fought for the best terms they could get. The Treaty of Paris was signed on December 10, 1898. Under its terms, Spain gave up all claim to Cuba, which would become independent. Spain ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States outright, and Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million, a fig leaf payment that allowed Spain to claim it hadn't simply lost the islands. In a few strokes of a pen, the United States had acquired an empire. America now controlled islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific. It had naval bases that could project power around the world. It had overseas territories with millions of new subjects who had not consented to American rule. The treaty still had to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, and that sparked a fierce debate. Anti-imperialists, led by figures like William Jennings Bryan, Andrew Carnegie, Mark Twain, and many others, denounced the treaty. They argued that imperialism was un-American, that it violated the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that it would drag America into foreign conflicts, that it would militarize American society, that it would corrupt American democracy. They pointed out the hypocrisy of fighting a war supposedly to liberate Cuba while simultaneously conquering the Philippines. They warned that ruling overseas territories would require a large standing army and navy, would cost enormous amounts of money, and would inevitably lead to conflict. They were right about all of this, but they lost the argument. Pro-imperialists countered that the modern world required America to expand or be left behind. They argued that the Philippines couldn't be abandoned, that if America didn't take them, Germany or Japan would. They claimed that Filipinos weren't ready for independence, that American rule would be benevolent and temporary, that it was America's duty to spread civilization. They also made strategic arguments. Alfred Thayer Mahan and other naval theorists argued that controlling the Philippines was essential for American trade with China and for projecting naval power in Asia. Business interests talked about the opportunities for trade and investment. On February 6, 1899, the Senate ratified the Treaty of Paris by a vote of 57 to 27, just barely reaching the two-thirds majority required. The United States was now officially an imperial power. But the story doesn't end there. In the Philippines, Emilio Aguinaldo and his followers felt utterly betrayed. They had fought alongside the Americans, believing that they were fighting for independence. Instead, they found themselves with a new colonial master. On February 4, 1899, just 2 days before the Senate vote, fighting broke out between American soldiers and Filipino independence fighters. What started as a skirmish quickly escalated into a full-scale war. The Philippine-American War would last for 3 years and cost far more American lives than the Spanish-American War. It would be a brutal, ugly conflict, fought not with conventional battles, but with guerrilla warfare, insurgency, and counterinsurgency. American forces would use tactics including torture, mass detention, and scorched earth policies. Filipino fighters would use ambushes, terrorism, and attacks on American supply lines. Tens of thousands of Filipinos would die, most of them civilians caught in the crossfire or killed by disease and famine. The war exposed the dark side of American imperialism. Soldiers' letters home described atrocities, burning villages, killing prisoners. There were accounts of American troops using the water cure, a form of torture, to interrogate Filipino prisoners. Some American commanders adopted policies of taking no prisoners. The war was unpopular at home, with anti-imperialists pointing to it as proof that imperialism would corrupt American values. But the war was also kept out of the headlines as much as possible. It didn't fit the triumphant narrative of American expansion. Eventually, after Aguinaldo was captured in 1901 and organized resistance collapsed, the war wound down. The Philippines would remain an American colony until 1946. Puerto Rico and Guam, by contrast, were occupied with relatively little resistance. Both islands became American territories, though their legal status was ambiguous. Were they part of the United States or not? Did the Constitution apply there? Did their residents have rights? These questions would be answered, sort of, in a series of Supreme Court cases called the Insular Cases, which basically held that territories belonging to, but not part of the United States, could be governed differently than states, and that their residents had some, but not all constitutional rights. It was a convenient legal fiction that allowed the United States to rule colonial territories without either fully incorporating them or granting them independence. Puerto Ricans would not become U.S. citizens until 1917, and even then, they had no vote in federal elections. Cuba got a different treatment, but not exactly independence. American forces occupied the island until 1902, setting up a military government. When Cuba finally got its independence, it was with strings attached. The Platt Amendment, forced into the Cuban Constitution, gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs if American interests were threatened. It also gave the United States the right to establish naval bases on Cuban soil. The naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which the United States still holds today, dates to this period. So Cuba was nominally independent, but effectively under American control. It would remain that way, more or less, until 1959. So what did all of this mean? How did a 3-month war transform the United States into a superpower? The most immediate effect was that America suddenly had a global presence. With bases in the Caribbean and the Pacific, the U.S. Navy could operate anywhere in the world. American ships patrolled the Caribbean, protecting the approaches to a future canal across Central America. American ships in Manila could project power across Asia, protecting American trade interests and countering European and Japanese influence. The United States was no longer just a continental power. It was an oceanic power with the military reach that came with that status. The war also transformed American foreign policy. Before 1898, the United States had largely stayed out of international affairs beyond the Western Hemisphere. After 1898, America was an active player on the world stage. American diplomats participated in conferences deciding the future of China, negotiating trade agreements, mediating conflicts. Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901 after McKinley's assassination, pursued an aggressive foreign policy, building the Panama Canal, expanding the Navy, mediating the end of the Russo-Japanese War, sending the Great White Fleet around the world to show off American power. This was a fundamental shift. America had decided that it was a great power and that great powers shaped world events. The war validated the big Navy strategy that Mahan and others had advocated. Congress funded massive naval expansion. By World War I, the U.S. Navy would be one of the largest in the world. This naval power would be crucial in both world wars, and it remains the foundation of American global power today. The Spanish-American War proved that modern industrial nations could project power globally through naval force, and America took that lesson to heart. Economically, the new territories provided some of what expansionists had hoped for. The Philippines became an important market for American goods and a source of raw materials. Puerto Rico's sugar industry came under American control, but the economic benefits were more limited than many had expected. The territories cost money to govern and defend. They didn't solve America's economic problems. The Panic of 1893 ended not because of imperial expansion, but because of the natural economic cycle and the discovery of new gold deposits. Still, the perception that colonies were economically valuable drove American foreign policy for decades. The war also shaped American identity and politics in profound ways. The easy victory reinforced American confidence and a sense of national destiny. The United States had defeated a European power in a matter of months. American technology, American organization, American fighting men had proven superior. This fed into a growing sense of American exceptionalism, the idea that America was special, chosen, destined to lead. It also fed militarism. Before the war, the United States had been skeptical of large military establishments, seeing them as a threat to democracy. After the war, maintaining a large navy and expanding the army seemed like necessities of great power status. The war coincided with and reinforced racial ideas that were dominant at the time. The victory over Spain was seen by many as proof of Anglo-Saxon superiority over Latin peoples. The decision to take the Philippines was justified with racist arguments about the need to civilize lesser races. These ideas would shape American policy for decades, from segregation at home to imperial policies abroad. They also led to tragic contradictions. African American soldiers fought bravely in Cuba and the Philippines, proving their courage and patriotism, but returned home to a country that denied them basic rights. Some African American leaders supported the war and imperialism, hoping it would earn African Americans more respect. Others, like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, were critical, seeing parallels between American treatment of Filipinos and American treatment of black citizens. The war created templates for future American military interventions. The pattern of quick military victory followed by a difficult occupation and guerrilla war would repeat in various forms throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. The use of humanitarian justifications for military intervention, the gap between stated ideals and actual policy, the difficulty of establishing stable governments in occupied territories, all of these would be recurring themes. Perhaps most fundamentally, the war marked the moment when the United States decided to abandon George Washington's advice to avoid entangling alliances and foreign adventures. For over a century, American foreign policy had been largely isolationist, focused on continental expansion and avoiding European conflicts. The Spanish-American War and the acquisition of an overseas empire made isolation impossible. America now had interests and territories around the world that had to be defended. This required alliances, diplomatic engagement, military presence, all the things that Washington had warned against. Once started down this path, there was no turning back. The decision to become an imperial power in 1898 set in motion a trajectory that would lead to American involvement in World War I, to American dominance after World War II, to the Cold War, and to America's role as the world's sole superpower at the end of the 20th century. It's worth asking what would have happened if America hadn't fought the war, or if it had fought but not taken the territories. Would America have eventually become a superpower anyway? Probably yes. The United States had enormous advantages in terms of size, population, resources, and industrial capacity. It was geographically isolated from potential enemies by two oceans. It was almost inevitable that America would become a major power. But the timing and the specific form that power took were shaped by the decisions made in 1898. By choosing to acquire overseas territories, by choosing to build a global navy, by choosing to engage in world affairs, American leaders accelerated the process and set a particular pattern. The Spanish-American War was in many ways an unnecessary conflict. Spain was a declining power that posed no real threat to the United States. The war was fought partly for humanitarian reasons that were genuine, but also partly for reasons of national pride, economic interest, and political advantage. The decision to take the Philippines was even more questionable. There was no compelling reason America needed the islands. But wars and the decisions that follow from them are rarely purely rational. They're shaped by ideas, emotions, ambitions, fears, and accidents of history. In 1898, a combination of factors came together at the right moment to push America into empire. The people who lived through these events understood that something momentous had happened. Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war, a phrase that captured the American perspective but ignored the perspectives of Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and especially Filipinos. For Americans, it had been quick, relatively cheap, and gloriously successful. For the people in the territories America acquired, it meant a new colonial master and decades of foreign rule. The war made heroes like George Dewey and Theodore Roosevelt, who rode his Rough Riders fame all the way to the presidency. It gave the United States confidence and ambition. It changed how America saw itself and how the world saw America. Looking back from our vantage point more than a century later, we can see the Spanish-American War as a turning point. It was the moment when the United States shifted from being a regional power to being a global power, from being a nation that stayed out of world affairs to being a nation that actively shaped them. It was the moment when America acquired its first overseas colonies and grappled with the contradictions between its democratic ideals and its imperial ambitions. It was the moment when American military power, particularly naval power, proved itself capable of global reach. And it was the moment when decisions made in Washington began to have immediate consequences in places thousands of miles away. The war lasted only 3 months, but its effects lasted for generations. The territories acquired in 1898 shaped American foreign policy throughout the 20th century. The Philippines remained an American colony until after World War II and remains closely tied to the United States today. Puerto Rico is still an American territory, its political status still unresolved. Cuba's relationship with the United States, from the Platt Amendment to the Cuban Revolution to the present day, was shaped by events in 1898. Guam remains an American territory and an important military base. The naval power that America built up during and after the war became the foundation of American military dominance. The confidence and ambition that came from the easy victory in 1898 shaped how Americans thought about their country's role in the world. There's a direct line from the Spanish-American War to the Panama Canal, which Theodore Roosevelt pushed through in the first decade of the 20th century, using tactics that included supporting a revolution in Colombia to create the new nation of Panama. There's a direct line to American intervention in World War I, when American troops and American naval power helped tip the balance against Germany. There's a direct line to World War II, when American naval forces fought across the Pacific, using bases and experience that dated back to 1898. There's a direct line to the Cold War, when America's global network of bases and alliances, built on foundations laid in 1898, contained Soviet expansion. And there's a direct line to the present day, when American military forces are deployed around the world, when American naval power dominates the seas, when American foreign policy assumes that the United States has both the right and the duty to shape events globally. None of this was inevitable. Different choices could have been made. The war might not have been fought. The territories might not have been taken. America might have remained more isolationist, more focused on its own hemisphere, less involved in global affairs. But history is made of the choices that were actually made, not the ones that might have been. In the spring and summer of 1898, American leaders chose war. They chose empire. They chose to make the United States a global power. And in doing so, they set in motion changes that would reshape not just America, but the entire world. The Spanish-American War showed that America had the industrial capacity, the military power, and the will to project force globally. It showed that America could defeat a European power decisively. It showed that America was ready to abandon its traditional isolationism and engage actively in world affairs. And it showed that America, despite its democratic ideals and its revolutionary origins, was willing to become a colonial power when its leaders believed that doing so served American interests. These revelations in 1898 announced to the world that a new power had arrived, one that would increasingly dominate the 20th century and beyond. In just 3 months, everything changed. The United States went to war as a regional power and emerged as a superpower with global reach, and the world would never be quite the same again.